This week on Quadriga, Iraq and beyond. Time for new alliances? The rapid advance of the Islamist terror group ISIS in Iraq has exposed how fragile this multi-ethnic state is. Shiite Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki has been in power for 8 years. Over that time, the minority Sunni population has come to feel like second-class citizens compared to the Shia majority. Iraq has a 1 million-man strong army and yet has dissolved when confronted by the few thousand members of ISIS. It appears the Iraqi state is crumbling. Iran's President Hassan Rouhani says his country will not remain passive if ISIS fighters take over Shia holy sites in Iraq. With fighting intensifying, does the West have to seek new strategies to prevent Islamist militants imposing a caliphate state on Iraq? Your host this week, Melinda Crane.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga. What, if anything, can still prevent ISIS from tearing apart Iraq and perhaps other countries as well? And what form might U.S.-Iranian cooperation take? What could it achieve? Those are some of the questions we want to ask today in a discussion with 3 people who've been following events in the Middle East very closely. And they are Amir Musawy. He's from Iraq and he reports from Berlin for Iraqia TV. He has also worked with the Associated Press in London and acted as a media consultant to the Iraqi Foreign Ministry and to several NGOs. A warm welcome to you. Andrew Denison is American and he heads the research group Transatlantic Networks. Formerly a senior fellow with the Institute for Strategic Analysis in Bonn, he frequently comments on security policy for German broadcasters. Great to have you on the show again, Andrew. And finally, we're pleased to have with us today Michael Lüders. He's an author and political advisor with extensive experience in the Middle East, including as correspondent for the German newspaper Die Zeit. His works include documentaries for German public television and both non-fiction and fiction works on Middle Eastern topics. Mr. Musawy, what are you hearing from the people back home? What's their reaction and how worried are they about this rampage across Iraq?
Well, I think it's the question of where you are asking this question. If you are asking this question in north of Iraq, in the provinces in Salah ad-Din or in Mosul, the people are really concerned about this, the last development inside Iraq. But if you ask this question in an area like Najaf, in Shiite area in Najaf or in South Iraq, in Basra, people are really very enthusiastic to go to fight this terrorist, and they argue that this is a problem for all Iraqi. It's not just a problem for Shiite, as we hear in the media. People concerned about this extremists because they are following all the pictures what they see in the media and also in the newspaper what ISIS fighters made with many soldiers in Tikrit and mass executing in Mosul. The people are concerned, but at the same time they feel very enthusiastic to go to fight these fighters.
Michael Lüders, give us a sense of the historic perspective here, if you would. How far-reaching are these changes that we're seeing?
Well, they are, of course, very fundamental changes, not only for Iraq, but for the whole region, because what we see here is really the military advance of a terrorist group with very strong roots in the Sunni tribal areas that are advancing towards Baghdad. They will probably not be able to seize power in Iraq because, you know, it's just 10 to 20,000 fighters and they are not able to beat the Shiite population, and the Shiites, they are not willing to be subjugated by Sunni tribesmen. But anyway, it's the first time that we have to deal with a terrorist organization that is not only strong in Iraq, but also in Syria. Both countries, Syria and Iraq, seem to be falling apart. And within this chaos that we observe these days, ISIS, has been able to really gain control of large swaths of territory, not only in Iraq, but also in Syria. We have to keep in mind that Iraq is not a country like the United States or Germany, for that matter. It's more or less, it's a tribal society to a large extent. We are talking about a very strong influence of religious and ethnic groups, not because people dislike Shiites or Sunnis, but because the central state, the government, is so weak. And of course, when a country falls apart, what do people do? They turn to those identities they already know, which is their clan, their tribe, their religious or their ethnic belief. So in other words, it's a very complicated issue. And once things get shifting, as we see it in Iraq these days, it's very difficult to get hold of the situation any longer. Iraq is a state falling apart, and the security matters that follow, they will really be of big concern for the Europeans and the Americans in the years to come.
I want to come back to some of those ethnic and tribal tensions that you mentioned, but Andrew Denison, tell us first, is it possible that we are overestimating the threat from ISIS because of the speed and geographical reach of its rampage across Iraq? The fact is, many military analysts say ISIS is quite definitely overextended at this point.
Yeah, I would see it that way as well, Melinda. I think when you label this show Time for New Alliances, I would say time of new alliances, and that one of the fundamental problems of ISIS is that even though it has achieved a temporary alliance with disenfranchised Sunni tribes, as Mr. Lüders alluded to, in Anbar and even in other provinces, a temporary alliance because Baghdad under al-Maliki gave them nothing. Even though America wanted them to, the Europeans wanted them to, everyone did. So a temporary alliance offered ISIS an opportunity to go into Iraq, also to loot and pillage, to gain weapons, money, recruits. But I think that the fundamental weakness of ISIS is that it is unable to form long-lasting alliances. It outwears its welcome. And the response, I think, that will come from Iraq, even without Turkey, America, or Iran intervening in some sort of new alliance, in itself, I think will face ISIS with a fundamental threat. So yes, I do think the military power should not be overestimated, but the political prowess in achieving these alliances in Iraq should not be underestimated.
Amir Musawy, let's come back to this question of the Sunni-Shiite tensions. And I'd like to ask you the personal question. What group are you affiliated with, and how important is that to you personally?
Well, this is the most important question that my friends ask me every time when they see something about Iraq. In fact, I am Iraqi in the first term, but I understood in 2003 that I'm a Shiite. Before, it was not very important for me to know whether I am Sunni or Shiite. But in 2000...
What did that have to do with the start of the U.S. invasion?
Because the sectarian conflict began after the invasion of the United States in 2006, for example, especially in Baghdad, where I lived and where I was born. There is a neighborhood begin to separate it between Sunni and Shiite. My family should leave my neighborhood because we are living west of Baghdad, which is more the popularity of their Sunnis, and we are Musawy family. It's well known a Shiite family. It was a danger for them to stay longer there in 2008. I just want to give you an example about how is important or not important for Iraqis to be a Shiite and a Sunni in the past. There is a families, there is a husband and a wife, there is a brothers, one of them Sunni, another Shiite. Iraqi, I can say, live together long time together between Sunni and Shiite without any problems. But the problems come when the politic use this sectarian differences as a tools to arriving political goals. This is the point, and this is the problem.
Michael Lüders, Mr. Musawy mentioned those critical dates, 2006 to 2008. That was a period of terrible Sunni-Shiite bloodletting in the wider population. Now, even if we agree that ISIS is not all that large a force, is there a threat that it is reigniting those kinds of tensions in the larger population as a whole?
Yes, I would think so. I mean, we need to understand that ISIS, of course, is a terrorist organization, but it's not sufficient to assume that it is only a terrorist organization. It would be easy to fight and to beat a terrorist organization if it were just, made up of 100 few people. This is not the case. We're talking about a Sunni uprising against Shiite rule in Baghdad, which means that many tribes in the western parts of Iraq bordering Syria, and from there they had invaded Syria before, and they are now really giving a hard time to the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. These Sunni tribes, they have come to the conclusion that it doesn't make any sense to cooperate with the government in Baghdad because this government is not willing to give them anything. So they took up arms. So many of these tribal people in the western provinces of Iraq, they do not share this extremist ideology of ISIS, but they have understood that ISIS is able to wage war. They know how to fight, and they are not only radical Muslims fighting here. We also have quite a few former members of the Ba'ath Party, of the ruling party of Saddam Hussein, of the old regime, former military and army men who were fired after the toppling of Saddam Hussein. And they joined the uprising in the early 2000s, and now we are seeing them spearheading this movement alongside radical Muslims. So it's really a complex mixture, and the Sunnis want power back in Baghdad. Will they be able to achieve this? I wouldn't assume that they're able to really take over Baghdad because there are too many Shiites living there, and it's not possible for a Sunni militia to gain hold in non-Sunni areas. And also the Shiites would never be willing to bow to the influence of a Sunni radical militia. So in other words, there would be heavy fighting around Baghdad should they really try to conquer the capital. I don't think they will for the time being, but they will try to surround Baghdad by military means and put strong pressure on the government, hoping that it falls apart, that people will just, leave the country for fear of their life.
But certainly we are seeing new sectarian tensions in the broader population. In the town of Baquba, for example, not too far away from Baghdad, the bodies of 44 Sunni prisoners were found in a government-run police station. In other words, Shiite sections of the population striking back. Let's take a closer look now at that Sunni-Shiite divide and its origins.
The terror group ISIS is made up of the Sunni branch of Islam, which is a minority group in Iraq. Shia Islam is followed by the majority of Iraqis. This is the city of Kerbala. It's one of the most sacred places in Iraq for Shia Muslims. The Prophet Muhammad's nephew Imam Hussein is buried here. Sunnis and Shias are divided over the right of the Prophet's descendants to succeed him. Iraq's Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki has been criticized for favoring the Shia population over the Sunnis. Ordinary Iraqi Sunni Muslims have grown to dislike what they see as the overbearing rule of the Shia government. It's thanks to that resentment and a weak Iraqi army that ISIS has been able to move so quickly towards Baghdad.
Andrew Denison, the U.S. government has said repeatedly, look, this problem is political rather than military. Would you agree with that?
Of course, we live on a planet where every political problem has a military facet. But to think that this problem can be solved with drone strikes, with air strikes, with arming the Iraqi army, Shia forces, whatever, also working militarily with Iran or Turkey, that's not the game. But to say no military role, you can't say that either. What you can say is that the politics of exclusion that we have seen, the disenfranchised Sunnis, because the Baghdad government is not willing to cooperate with them, as America has wished. And America has often made weapons deliveries contingent on political deals that then haven't come. Okay? That political cooperation. Now, to enlarge the picture a little bit, Iran. Many think that Iran has pushed Maliki or backed him in an exclusive politics of giving all the treasures of government and rule to the Shia. Thus, as we have heard, opening up prospects for, the entrepreneurs of terror, the former military people, to come up with new alliances with ISIS fighters from Syria. And as Mr. Lüders alluded to, it's a potent mix.
Amir Musawy, what might a political solution look like? Is there another potential leader out there who could actually glue these very disparate factions and conflicting sects back together in a government of national unity?
I think when we discuss in the media about Mr. Maliki is one of the problem of this whole situation in Iraq, maybe it would be not very, very correct. I think the problem is in the area, in the region, and also inside Iraq. What we saw last 2 days, the Iraqi leaders, political leaders from Sunni and Shiite and also Kurds, did meet together and make an announcement that they are a unit against ISIS fighters. This is a good signal. This is first good news. The second good news could be a map or a plan from the region which United States lead this situation to try to give all the countries inside board and to let them push over to have a solution of this political problem, because without discussion with Saudi Arabia, without discussion with Iran, we still walking in the same place in Iraq and asking Maliki or not Maliki. Maybe we will have another person. Maybe we will have the same problem. It is not the personal of Maliki. It's a problem of the sectarian violence in the region.
Let me come back to the idea of some kind of regional council, but start out by talking about the U.S. role. If we look back to that period, 2006 to 2008, when Sunni Shiite bloodletting also occurred, as I mentioned earlier, the fact is, Michael Lüders, it was stopped because the U.S. paid tribal Sunni leaders to basically rise up and fight against al-Qaeda in Iraq, as it was called then. Did the U.S. wash its hands of Iraq too soon? Clearly, it doesn't have that kind of leverage or foothold anymore. Is this problem essentially that the U.S. walked away?
In a way it is, yes. I mean, there's a certain thinking within, Western political circles that once you do a regime change, you leave the business to locals, which in a way is understandable because it's very difficult to walk the right line. Either if you do too much, you're being considered to be a neo-imperialist or whatever. If you don't do enough, then you have a situation like we see it in Iraq now. But we have a very similar situation in Libya. Gaddafi was toppled there, all right, with the help of NATO, but after his toppling, nobody seemed to care in Europe, in the US, about what's happening in that country, and the result is now that Libya is falling apart, and the fallout of this falling apart reaches countries far away, such as Mali and Nigeria, Boko Haram sect there. So what we have is basically a problem of states falling apart in the Middle East and Northern Africa, and nobody really has a recipe what to do about it. I mean, it's one thing to invade a country militarily, hoping for the best and hoping for a government that is pro-Western afterwards. But then, what do you do once realities turn out to be more complex? And we have a situation, as we see it in Iraq now. It's not possible to turn the clocks back, of course. What can we do? And the answer is there are no easy options. This is a conflict that will continue for many more years to come.
Andrew Denison, is that right? Could and should the U.S. have done more? You mentioned earlier they did put pressure on Maliki, clearly without success. And the fact is they couldn't get a status of forces agreement out of him in order to keep the troops there.
Well, could have, should have, would have, With these kind of things, you can't predict the future. You roll the dice, but you know that you have a certain probability of success. You always have to plan for failure. Now, too, if peace overtures don't work, if a unity government in Iraq does not come together, there could be a major war, and it could cost more. Certainly Americans are tired after the sacrifices they made in Iraq over 10 years, didn't feel they had the international solidarity, perhaps they wanted to. But Melinda, when I look at this, I remember 2 weeks ago I stood on the beaches of Normandy, and a couple of things bear on this question, too, today of the Mideastern alliances. The first thing is great power war is catastrophic. It is horrendous, and we don't have that today. World War II was something else. Now, we have Russians and Americans with nuclear-armed missiles. We could cause 100 times the damage of World War II if they were launched, but that's probably not going to happen. The second thing is peace is incredibly expensive. Think of all the lives lost to liberate Europe. Think of the billions put into Europe afterwards. We haven't done that in the Mideast. But the final thing you see in Normandy is people from all around the world, and certainly Europe, come together there. And they remind us it's alliances that count. It's about who has the most friends win. And at the end of the day, with all of America's military power, if the local alliances cannot be sustainable and not be so exclusive, we're just going to have to wait until they're ready. I don't think we can force them. You know, in Wyoming they say you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink.
Amir Musawy, what would you want to see the U.S. do now?
I think Mr. Andrew announced very important points when he said the peace is very important here in Europe. In point of view, in my opinion, that this peace now in danger in Europe, if ISIS going to gain more power in Iraq and Syria. We are close to Europe, Iraq and Syrian border, and there is just Turkey between Europe and this region. I think this is very important point that you said that the peace now in danger. Look what happened in Brussels for 3 weeks. There's fighters came back from Syria and beginning to shooting in Brussels. This is the fighters' problem in Iraq, in Syria with ISIS. They are maybe going back here to Europe, and they are well trained and have capability to fight.
The problem is not many people in Germany see it that way. I see the Near East as very near to Europe, but many people say too far away, and I mean, Herr Lüders, you would agree too, we don't have the means to solve those problems, or at least not at the price we want to pay. We don't want to pay much, you know.
Lüders, how grave is the potential threat of ISIS terrorist strikes against Europe or the US? And if it is a serious threat, what does that tell us we should do? Would airstrikes on ISIS make the problem worse or better?
Well, airstrikes could certainly, slow down the advance of the ISIS troops in Iraq, but they wouldn't be able to solve the problem. There is no military solution to this problem. We have a huge area in the Middle East, starting with Iraq and Syria, and probably it will go on. It will continue in Lebanon and in Jordan, of failing states and failed states. And once a state has fallen apart, it's very difficult to put it back into order. So we have to get used to the idea that for the next 10, 15, 20 years to come, we will have a region of instability right at the doorsteps of Europe, of Turkey, for that matter. And this will not only be a serious threat to the security of the whole region, for Israel, for Saudi Arabia, Egypt, other countries, but also, of course, for Europe. Because as Mr. Musawy mentioned, there are, of course, many fighters coming from Europe, fighting in Syria, fighting in Iraq. They do get a military education there. They come back to Europe and might think about terror strikes to prepare them here in Europe. And the Minister of the Interior of Germany, yesterday he presented his report on a security analysis for Germany for the time to come, and he was very much warning about the potential outfall of these events going on in the Middle East for Germany and for Europe in general.
Andrew Denison, what about the threat to the U.S.? The Obama government is said to have considered ISIS so far not so much directly a threat to the U.S., and therefore that is one of the reasons apparently for the hesitancy in proceeding militarily. Some people in the government apparently think that ISIS is more likely to strike the U.S. if it does take military action against ISIS. How do you see that?
Well, first question, how do you calculate the probability of a terror attack at any time? And that's a question of a terror group's feelings towards the United States, but also, has been pointed out, David Ignatius, I think, recently, whether a terror group is in competition with another terror group to get recruits, and therefore, who can do the bigger attack with the more media attention. And that brings us to the real question, what happens if another 9/11 size attack occurs in the United States or Europe? It will change the political equations of all the actors. We can hope that we unite. We will certainly be willing to spend more on defense than we do now, I would assume. Whether we fail as badly as we did after 9/11, I would hope not. I would hope not. But I think at the end of the day, you have to look at the Middle East as seeing it as an extension of this European area. And in the same way, NATO and the European Union brought peace to the blood feuding of Europe. You know, the Arab world is part of European history. And I think no other alternative than some sort of, you know, we call it OSCE, but the heads of state getting together, working to build peace. Of course, you have to build from the bottom up. And feel like maybe a last point. When I was in Normandy, I talked to a lot of American soldiers. And they were extremely proud of their tactical success in building stability in small neighborhoods one at a time. But they were ashamed of the strategic failure, that there was no political overarching structure to make a victory out of that success. Instead, they were all these lost victories. And that's always a danger.
I mean, Musawy, let's briefly talk about the neighborhoods in Iraq that have already been overrun by ISIS. As I understand it, the ISIS fighters tend to behave like guerrilla warriors. That means they don't wear uniforms, they tend to live with civilians together. They're by no means marching like an army through the countryside. Apparently, that makes any attempt to defeat them militarily through airstrikes very difficult indeed.
What we are facing now in Iraq, the third generation of Al-Qaeda. We have the first Al-Qaeda generation, Bin Laden and Zawahiri, and the second was the Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi in Iraq. And what we are facing now, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and his ISIS militants, this is the third generation of Al-Qaeda. And what they are doing, they are avoiding the mistakes that the first and the second generation did in the past. They're using the media, the social media, in the perfect way to make a propaganda. They are avoiding all the problems that they can put from the government in their field. They are using the civilians in a very tactical and good way to hiding and to and if you attack them, there is a civilians going to die, and they will show it as a propaganda in the social media. We have a combination of strategical military operation from the ex-officers from Iraqi army at Saddam time, and we have a terrorist act, and they are combining with all these elements, and that's why it made them very effective nowadays, and in my opinion, somehow successful.
So, Michel, Lüders definitely reinforcing your point that there is no easy military solution here. Let's talk about what some form of political solution might look like then. We're hearing a lot about new alliances in the sense of possible cooperation between the U.S. and Iran. What form could it take, and would it truly be effective?
It's difficult to say. The very fact that Americans and Iranians loudly think about cooperating, at least talking to each other on this issue, is, of course, you know, a little sensation, so to speak. It would have been unimaginable 5 or 10 years ago, but now there's talk going on about it. Of course, it would be a nice picture to see, you know, Islamic fighters from Iran hand in hand with GIs fighting in Iraq. This will not happen. There will be no military cooperation between Iran and the US, but still it will enhance the desire of pragmatic forces both in Iran and in the US to continue the normalization of relations between the two countries. It will also add up to the nuclear negotiations that take place these days between Iran and the Western powers. So I think we might expect more leniency, more willingness to accept a compromise due to these recent developments. Also the Kurds, of course, in the north of Iraq, they are the big winners of this situation, not only in the north of Iraq, but also in Syria and in the southeast of Turkey, where they live. They have really cashed in on their political potential. They have conquered a couple of towns that are very important to add to their territory, and their relationship with Turkey is very good. It's a little bit strange to see Turkey, a country that suppresses its own Kurdish population in the southeast of the country, cooperating so closely with the Kurds in the north of Iraq, which means that in the long run the Turks will have to rethink their attitudes towards the Kurds in their own country.
Let's come back to Turkey in just a moment, but this is very complex. Let's stay with that U.S.-Iranian question. We've heard some change in tone from Iran already this week.
Absolutely.
Now, supposedly, Iran has been speaking with U.S. representatives on the margins of the nuclear weapons talks that are nuclear energy talks that are going on in Vienna. Is it possible that those consultations are already bearing fruit in these new sounding statements out of Tehran?
It's too early to say. I mean, let us not forget there are hardliners in Iran and hardliners in the US who are not interested in a normalization of relations. And of course, the Iranians want to see the lifting of the sanctions against Iran. And in order for these sanctions to be lifted, Congress has to approve the lifting of these sanctions. And to see Congress lifting these sanctions appears to me, for the time being at least, a very difficult concept. So this needs quite more persuasion. I think that these negotiations, they will be prolonged for another 6 months or so. They will not reach a final status by the end of July, as was foreseen. So, yes, the business is going on. It is very important that Washington and Tehran talk to each other, and it means that, a new page of history is being opened, hopefully. Because, Iran, when you look at it on the map, whether you like the government or not, Iran is the only stable country between the Mediterranean and India. To the west and to the east of Iran, you have nothing but instability and countries falling apart. So the least good idea would be to weaken Iran further. It's the last country in the region that is able to organize to exercise a certain control in the region.
Andrew Denison, many people would say, if anything, Iran is the winner in this whole situation and, in fact, is more part of the problem than the solution. Iran, after all, had been a strong backer of al-Maliki, who is very much the scoundrel in this whole story.
Yes, well, I guess I would say, Melinda, which Iran is the winner? The good Iran or the bad Iran? Because as Mr. Lüders alluded to, Iran is of central significance to the United States. Since the end of the Ottoman Empire, the peace to end all peace, as they called it back then, the British were there. It was interesting for us, certainly since the end of World War II. And even as the Ayatollahs have ruled Iran, there have always been Americans who say, at the end of the day, Iran is the most important partner. And if we can build relations with them, we have much easier time with all the other problems. Not easy, the Middle East is like the Game of Thrones, and it's not just about civic society, it's about status and warrior ethos and all sorts of
Okay, so
big
what
problems.
could constructive cooperation with Iran look like?
So what could constructive cooperation with Iran look like? As alluded to, pressure on the al-Maliki government to be more open to the Sunnis. Above that, I think a willingness, yes, they're going to have to take further steps on nuclear arms. That also eases up the problem between the Israelis and the Palestinians if Iran is not seen as such a big threat. But there are some Americans, Melinda, who say, yes, we hope Iran will be cooperative, but they're still very anti-American. And maybe we should just let these ideological rivals, the Sunnis and the Shiites, fight it out. A little bit of the old Stalingrad principle in America. Let the enemies of democracy kill each other, and when they're done with that, then step in. Like the little story, the little Black Sambo for people who know American culture.
Amir Musawy, isn't a strong Iran exactly what the Sunnis in your country are worried about? Wouldn't a stronger role for Iran in this whole situation possibly make things worse?
I think United States administration make a mistake if just talk with Iran about Iraq, because they are going to crash in front of the wall of the Sunnis, Arab Sunnis in Saudi Arabia and Qatar and other Arab states. I think it may be wiser to talk with each part, with Saudis and Qataris and also with Iranian, to solve the problem in the region, because we are not talking about just in Iraq. We are talking about in Syria, we are talking about in Bahrain, we are talking in different areas, even in Libya. If you talk about this problem, you can bring Iran and bring Saudi Arabia in one boat together, in one road map in the region to find stability. And because if you finish with the problem in Iraq, let us say, I hope, you will still have the problem in Syria, and Iranian have a big influence in Iran and in Syria, and also in Lebanon. This is the point what I can imagine that United States can push is Saudi Arabia and Qatar to make more event, more work to solve the problem, to sit with the Iranian and talk about the problems in a whole.
Michael Lüders, Saudi Arabia and Qatar have also been part of the problem rather than solution to date. They have certainly been funding many of the rebels in Syria, of course. Apparently now rethinking that to some degree. They are getting worried. Do you see real potential here for the kind of cooperation that Amir Musawy is talking about? A wider regional Congress designed to solve both Syria and Iraq? Is it conceivable?
Well, it would be, a very positive thinking, and it would be very much advisable for the region if that really took place. But I'm afraid that this is really wishful thinking. When you look at Arab leadership over the past decades, regardless of the issue we're talking about, this Arab leadership has miserably failed in all aspects. I do not see the leaders of Egypt, of Saudi Arabia, of Iraq, of Syria, or any other given country to sit together and to find pragmatic solutions for pragmatic issues. I do not see this. There is too much of a, how shall I say, tribal mentality of the willingness to really be the strong man of the region. The idea of power sharing is not very widely accepted. The basic idea of policymaking appears to be, I want to be stronger than you, and I try to get a hold of your forces, and you will think the same way about me. So the idea is not about cooperation, but about being the winner, because the winner takes it all, so to speak. And this mentality needs to change. Of course, the whole region is really undergoing changes that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. Nobody knows today what the region will look like in 6 months, leave alone a year from now. Nobody knows what's going to happen in Syria and Lebanon. How will these recent events in Israel and Palestine develop? Will there be another uprising in the Palestinian territories? How will this add fuel to the already ongoing crisis? What is going to happen in Egypt? Will this country also fall apart? There are strong indications that this might happen in the near future. We are talking about a region in serious trouble, and nobody has a recipe what to do about it. I don't think that the Americans have to be afraid of terror attacks by ISIS on their own territory, because you are lucky you have the Atlantic between the Americans and the Middle East and Europe. But I think Americans need to be careful. Their embassies, their business interests will be targeted in the Middle East and potentially also in Europe. So America and Europe, they have the same interest in getting a hold of this terrorist organization. How can we do it? The honest answer is nobody has a recipe. We have to wait. The good message is that ISIS will not be able to really rule territory in the long run, because the radicality of their ideology does not appeal to normal Sunni Muslim believers. They dislike this. For the time being, they see this as a lesser evil compared to the government of Baghdad, of the Shiites. But in the long run, people will tell ISIS very clearly, we don't want your extremism. And they have no idea how to govern a country, how to really rule a country. And for that reason, they will fail. But unfortunately, this will be happening in 10, 15, 20 years from now.
Andrew Denison, at the time that the U.S. presence in Iraq was coming to an end, there was a lot of discussion in the U.S. about whether the most realistic solution might be simply to let the country be partitioned into a Sunni division, into a Shiite part, and into a Kurdish part. Are we now seeing that happen? Is that the ultimate result of this tectonic shift that is occurring now?
Well, as Mr. Lüders alluded to, outcomes are many. Possible outcomes are many. One of them could be this division into three. We saw that happen in Bosnia. It's the least bad option, if you will. Biden, Vice President of the United States, long a proponent of that idea as we were trying to deal with the surge. Biden, also the guy who's quoted at the end of Michael Gordon's huge book on Iraq, the guy from the New York Times, wrote, at the end he said, Biden too, this is a political problem. And the political challenge is what to do there. Now, to midwife a tripartite arrangement of Iraq, that would be an unfortunate option. We may have to, because of the reality on the ground. The way the forces are deployed is the way the peace treaty will be written. Now, from the West, I think we look at that region, we hope for the best, we hope political unity will come, we work on these principles, but we have to prepare for the worst as well, Melinda, and we also have to recognize the more we pay, the higher the chance of success. No guarantee, but to think that we don't have to pay anything will solve itself, That's wishful thinking too.
Amir Musawy, the borders that we know now in the Middle East were drawn up by a Frenchman and a Britishman during the early part of the 20th century, basically in a form of colonialism. Is it so terrible if those borders are now, if they fall away and a new constellation comes into being?
If we are going to walk in this rhythm, in this kind of conflict rhythm, we are going to see in the near future that this border is not anymore existing because the conflict, what we saw now, de facto now, Mosul and the east provinces of Syria, there is no borders. The fighters crossing the borders without any passports. But what I want to say, the outcome of the conflict could be successful if we create a national unit government inside Iraq with a cooperation and collaboration of Saudi Arabia and also Iran. And besides this also, we need definitely a military operation and support and backup from the United States, defeated these fighters, these extremists, because this is also in their, because this is also a problem, not just for Iraqi, not for Sunnite and Shiite, and also for European countries. This might be an outgoing, but it needs a long way, a long time, and a long efforts.
What would it mean, though, for your country and your region if indeed the Middle East, if the borders were to be redrawn? Aren't we talking about huge masses of refugees, terrible displacement, and an immense amount of human suffering?
We are not going to solve the problem. We are going to create new problems because this potential sectarian states, they will going to fight over the area between them. The Kurds will say Kirkuk is ours. The Arab Sunnis say no, we don't have any oil fields. We need this. And Shiite also will say this is really a problem if we find this borders fell down.
It's... And Mr. Musawy, what would happen though if we really got Tehran and Riyadh, Saudi Arabia and Iran to agree to stop supporting their friends in Iraq with arms? That Iran would say, we want a ceasefire here, they want a ceasefire there. I hear the music, so I mean, would you say that if they did that, would we be on a good road?
It could be possible if both countries understood that there is no solution just to live together and to solve the problem in political way. This is the optimistic version of what might occur, and I'm sure we will have opportunity to continue our discussions in future. Many thanks to all of you for being with us today, and thanks to all of you out there for tuning in. See you soon. Bye-bye.